establishing central space immediately, preparing for pawn advances and piece development. Developing a knight towards the center immediately prepares for pawn breaks and a flexible pawn structure, denying white easy central dominance. Asserting central control, white immediately challenges black's knight and prepares to exploit the d4 pawn's reach. Opening the diagonal for the bishop and solidifying central influence, this move anticipates a king's Indian or queen's Indian formation. Establishing a solid kingside presence, nf3 reinforces the pawn chain while preparing for kingside castling and potential central advances. Preparing to unleash the queen's Indian bishop, this pawn advance gambles slightly on space for long-term diagonal influence. Bolstering the center, this knight secures key squares and prepares for an active queenside development. Developing the bishop to target the center and prepare queenside castling solidifies black's position. Pinning the knight here immediately pressures black's center and hints at future pawn breaks or tactical possibilities. Challenging the pinned knight, this pins the nc3, creating immediate tactical possibilities and complicating white's central ambitions. Solidifying the center, e3 prepares to develop the kingside bishop, reinforcing the pawn chain and aiming for a more harmonious piece setup while keeping options open for castling. Challenging the bishop's placement immediately, this move forces a decision: retreat or trade, potentially creating imbalanced pawn structures and influencing future pawn breaks. Retreating the bishop maintains tension on the kingside and prevents an immediate capture, keeping options open for king safety development later. Sacrificing pawn structure for space is often a gamble, and here the pawn advance creates weaknesses around black's monarch, potentially opening lines for white's pieces later on, particularly if the bishop on h4 can be repositioned effectively. Retreating the bishop allows development while unpinning the knight, but it concedes valuable central space to black's aggressively advanced pawns. Boldly challenging white's central pawn structure, this knight's leap to e4 creates immediate tactical fireworks and aims to disrupt white's harmony. It's a dynamic bid for central space and initiative, potentially leading to exciting piece exchanges or a forceful pawn push. This maneuver consolidates white's queenside influence, preparing to contest the center and potentially exploit black's slightly exposed king. Exchanging the bishop for the knight fundamentally alters the pawn structure, creating isolated queenside pawns for white and opening a potential outpost on d4. Black sacrifices immediate development for long-term structural advantages, aiming to exploit the weakened center and potentially pressure the enemy king later. This aggressive pawn push, g5, has been a bold commitment from black, and this capture is a logical consequence, forcing white to confront the structural repercussions. Opening the b-file creates immediate attacking potential, though it also exposes white's king slightly by removing a defender. Black's aggressive pawn push on the king side has created weaknesses, and white now aims to exploit the open lines that have materialized. Consider how this structural change will influence piece activity moving forward, particularly for white's rooks. Solidifying the pawn structure on the queen side by advancing the d-pawn creates a firmer central presence and opens a diagonal for the dark-squared bishop, aiming to develop more active piece play and contest control of the central squares. Challenging black's central presence, white aims to activate the bishop by bringing it to d3, eyeing the weakened light squares on black's queen side and potentially preparing for future kingside pressure. A bold decision, immediately challenging white's central pawns and carving out a new diagonal for the dark-squared bishop by fanning out the kingside. This aggressive pawn push, while creating dynamic possibilities, undeniably weakens the pawn structure around your king, inviting potential tactical skirmishes and potentially leaving your monarch exposed if white can generate sufficient attacking pressure. The immediate question is whether the dynamism gained will outweigh the positional concessions. Unleashing a pawn storm to seize territory, this audacious pawn thrust challenges black's kingside structure and aims to gain space advantage, potentially suffocating black's pieces and restricting their development, while simultaneously creating a protected passed pawn candidate down the line if black isn't careful with their counterplay. Instantly unraveling the central pawn structure is a bold gambit, aiming to exploit the open lines that will inevitably emerge. Black liberates the d-file for potential piece activity and seeks to disrupt White's queenside solidity, though this exchange also opens avenues for White's own attacking ambitions. The critical question becomes whether Black can generate enough compensation for the structural concessions and the potential weakening of the kingside pawn shield. Unleashing the knight to patrol the central squares, this maneuver simultaneously pins the g-pawn to the king and prepares for potential raids into Black's weakened queenside pawn structure. Opening up the diagonal for the queen, a bold step that contests the central tension and seeks dynamic counterplay, potentially inviting sharp exchanges. Exploiting the open c-file, White initiates a direct confrontation in the center, aiming to shatter Black's pawn structure and seize the initiative through pawn advances. Liberating the bishop from its pawn shield, this capture immediately challenges the center and opens avenues for your queen and rook on the d-file, creating dynamic play. Unleashing a pawn storm in the center often comes with risks, and here White gambles on a direct assault, aiming to punish Black's slightly overextended knight and potentially create weaknesses around the king. The f3 push, while opening a line for the rook and intending to dislodge the intrusive e4, also significantly weakens White's kingside, leaving the e3 pawn exposed and creating a potential haven for Black's queen or bishops later on. This aggressive stance demands precise follow-up. Any hesitation or miscalculation could quickly turn this bold pawn advance into a positional liability. Liberating the knight from its cramped position allows it to eye crucial central squares and potentially disrupt White's pawn structure further, although it does hand over the bishop pair. Opening the kingside file presents a double-edged sword, potentially accelerating an attack but exposing the monarch to scrutiny. Developing the knight towards the center reestablishes piece activity after the trade, aiming to contest the crucial e5 square and prepare for potential attacks on the kingside, while also ensuring the knight isn't passively trapped on the edge. Unleashing the bishop from its cramped position, White aims to seize control of the d5 square, a pivotal point that has been contested since Black's pawn capture. This aggressive exchange sacrifices material for tempo and aims to disrupt Black's nascent kingside attack, potentially forcing concessions and creating weaknesses around the monarch. The immediate threat of piece activity and the potential for further pawn advances on the queenside warrant careful consideration from Black. The knight's daring leap to the center establishes a vital outpost, instantly challenging White's pawn structure and creating immediate pressure on the kingside. Unleashing the king's side, White opts for castling queenside, a bold declaration that transforms the center into a dynamic battlefield and injects immediate attacking potential along the now open c-file. This maneuver signals a clear intention to exploit the exposed Black king, preparing a swift cavalry charge with knights and pawns against its increasingly vulnerable position. Consider the immediate implications for piece placement. The king's departure from the center creates potential weaknesses, but also opens lines for active piece play, promising a sharp, double-edged middle game. Unleashing a pawn toward the queenside, Black aims to disrupt White's development and potentially create queenside play, though it weakens the pawn chain and offers White tactical opportunities on the now open c-file. Unlocking the d-file initiative, this pawn advance aggressively probes Black's central structure and threatens to create an unstoppable passed pawn, forcing a critical decision on how to address the burgeoning White presence. Unleashing the bishop on f7 finally addresses the vulnerability created on the kingside by the pawn structure, aiming to improve its defensive coordination and prepare for potential counterplay by pinning the knight on d4 indirectly. Unleashing a double-edged pawn storm, White boldly advances f4, seeking to crack open the center and exploit the exposed Black king, though this aggressive thrust creates its own vulnerabilities and invites counterplay. The Black king, abandoning its prior sanctuary, ventures into the fray, a bold step that immediately ignites the central tension. Its presence now on f8 dramatically alters the dynamic, opening up new avenues for counterplay while simultaneously exposing it to potential dangers from White's unleashed pieces. Unleashing a pawn storm to puncture Black's king's sanctuary, this thrust dramatically opens lines where none seem to exist, forcing a reassessment of defensive structures. Suddenly, the queenside pawn structure is severely compromised, opening the file for white's rook and creating lingering weaknesses around the black king. Unlocking a key diagonal for the queen's rook, this pawn sacrifice aims to disrupt black's pawn chain and open lines toward the beleaguered king. The immediate tactical consequence of clearing the e-file presents an attacking opportunity, forcing black to confront the exposed situation of their monarch. Challenging white's central initiative head-on, this queen sortie ignites immediate complications and forces a confrontation, potentially disrupting white's coordinated attacking pieces while exposing black's monarch to greater scrutiny. Unleashing a rook to the f-file initiates a potent offensive pressure, aiming to directly assault black's somewhat exposed monarch and leverage the open nature of the position after white's pawn advances. This maneuver fundamentally seeks to exploit the weakened dark squares around black's king, particularly the g7 square, and to prepare for potential piece sacrifices that could open further lines of attack. The intent is to transition from a tense positional struggle to a more direct, dynamic confrontation where white's initiative can flourish. The black king, now exposed by the pawn storm on the kingside, seeks refuge further back, hoping to escape white's menacing rook on the f-file. This maneuver acknowledges the immediate danger but also concedes precious time. Reasserting control over the central files, the rook slides to the open e-file, aiming to partner with its counterpart and pressure black's slightly exposed king. Shifting the queen to d6 now offers a potential reprieve by unpinning the knight and opening a path for the king's escape, while also preparing to contest the central d-file and shore up defenses around the monarch. Opening up the king's flank further, the bishop now seeks a more active diagonal, hinting at potential pressure along the e-file or even a swift regrouping towards the queenside.